Hello, everyone. Okay, so politics is the art of the possible, said someone. There's a Russian a political theorist who died in 1948, I believe, Ivan Ilyin. And he said that politics is the art of identifying and neutralizing the enemy. I have been reading a speech given by Vladimir Putin in 2013 to the, I think it's called the Valdai Club. It's the Valdai discussion forum, I think it's called, is a Moscow-based think tank and discussion forum, and it was started in 2004. It's named after the lake Valdai, which is located close to Veliki Novgorod, where the club's first meeting took place. Now, we Europeans are blocked from accessing the Kremlin website and all that, but I have found the speech written, and the reason I'm telling you this is that that speech correlates to what I'm going to say today, because Putin here addresses the issue of a battle going on, a different kind of war. This is 2013. Okay, just so that we place ourselves. This is Obama is president of the United States, and in 2013 Obama is still talking about marriage being a marriage between a man and a woman. This is before Brexit. This is before Trump's first election win. This is before the woke ideology firmly took root. This is before COVID. Okay, so just to place ourselves. Okay, so this is 2012. And Putin identified a war going on, a cultural war, a spiritual war, a moral war that most of us did not see coming at the time. He foresaw this early on in 2012. And I'm going to talk about this because the West is going through a very deep moral and spiritual decadence, resulting, I think, from those ideologies of they go by different names: modern liberalism, modernism, postmodernism, progressivism, call it as you wish, but all leading inevitably to absolute nihilism, all corrupting and all at the same time weakening the collective, the community, that collective that once upon a time we called in the West Christian civilization. This did not happen by chance. It was gradually, step by step, introduced, and so not to be noticed, imposed gradually on the population. This decadence can be seen in the disintegration of the social fabric of our countries, the dissolution of traditional values, family values, as Ronald Reagan used to say, when a family was, at the time, the union of a man and a woman united with their children. There are many forms of unions, but you may love whomever you wish. You can make love, there is another word for it, with whomever you choose. But a traditional family was so constituted for, among other things, certainly for the procreation and formation of children. All these new modernist ideas have undermined the foundation of Western societies as they promote moral relativism, sinking any ethical and moral criteria of life. They have fragmented the cultural identity of nations and promoted a nihilist culture that has dissolved, done away with practically all traditions, undermining the collective morality. There's only one way, the one that corresponds with the natural nature of things, and not with the relativist interpretations made now from a modernist or postmodernist viewpoint. All of them false, all of them perverted. Perverted, I use the word in that, what it means, something removed or contrary, something contrary to its nature, clumsy and corrupt and decadent and degenerate and degrading and immoral. Progressive liberalism, to give it a name, can anyone really say that this is not true? Has promoted a gender ideology in the West that invalidates the natural differences between a man and a woman, corrupts morality, destabilizes the family structure, a dissolution of the cultural identity, accompanied by social engineering, meaning that this is done on purpose, one that promotes cultural uniformity. They lie when they say it promotes diversity. Uniformity is what they are eager to promote. The dissolution of all national identities, imposing that moral relativism that corrupts the spiritual roots, has corrupted the spiritual roots of Western societies. Well, in response to this cultural crisis, this moral crisis, in response to this degradation of humanity, this degradation of man, in response to this destruction of a human being's most basic and essential values, Vladimir Putin has assumed the role. You will see it. I will quote from his speech in this talk that he gave, and many others, but this one particularly. He has assumed the role, certainly in his country, of defender of tradition and of what he calls Russian cultural sovereignty, in opposition to what he refers to as Western colonial ideological imperialism, something like that, promoting what he calls again a cultural resistance. This is how he names it, a cultural resistance based on Christian spirituality, in the case of Russia, Orthodox Christianity, which is that of his people, on Russian national identity linked to language, traditional family formed by a man and a woman and their children, which is what we all understood a family to be until yesterday. Children are the consequence of a life project in common, not a selfish whim of personal, individual realization of as woman. Mechanically almost paying for a man's semen with a Visa card. Sterile, really, if not in body, at least in sterile in mind, certainly in soul. So for Putin, Russia, he sees it as acting as a bulwark of European civilization, This is how he sees his country, a bulwark of Christian European civilization vis-à-vis the moral decadence of the West. He sees himself not only defending Russian culture, but actually of Russia offering a cultural and spiritual alternative. Since his return to the presidency in 2012, Putin has expressed many times and spoken about a vision of cultural resistance, a cultural war that rejects and confronts moral relativism, gender ideology, social engineering, a cultural resistance that defends cultural identity, that promotes Christian morality and spirituality as the core of Russian national identity, though in no way excluding other religions in his country, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism. It was very much on his mind to bring back that so much needed social cohesion, that sense of purpose after the fall of the Soviet Union and that awful decade of the 90s for Russia. Social cohesion, national pride, defense of tradition. Not only he saw that, not only to strengthen Russian national identity, but one that has also projected Russia as a defender of European civilization against the absolute, as he sees, this moral decadence of the so-called Western democracies. So Putin's cultural war against the West is based on a defense. It's based on the defense of traditional values. He defined it, defense of national identity, cultural sovereignty. This is a traditionalist movement, not ultra-conservative, not far-right, not reactionary. That's the trick, you see, language. The trick being to define you first, to place you there where they want you to be. But when you oppose this post-modernity, you are really opposing conservatives and liberals and Christian Democrats, progressives, communists, Marxists, Democrats. That is, you oppose the postmodern world in all its variants. It doesn't matter whether it is Republican or Democrats, conservatives or Labour or whatever it might be, Giorgia Meloni and her cousin. All and every one of them are versions, are aspects, facets of one and the same polyhedron, the postmodern world. The modern world will not be punished. The modern world is its own punishment. And opposition to it must be, I think, total, complete, integral, and absolute. The political party as such is irrelevant in this fight. All that nonsense does not matter, because all that is simply all that is what Spengler called those who follow that or opt for that, those who do not have or having achieved, for whatever reason, a higher form of deeper awareness. The masses, the herds, crowds, followers, the ones always joining the multitude, move solely by their instincts, unable to think, disturbed by noise. People who join attach themselves to these fetishes, as if these movements represented something different, though in reality they are all the same, part of the same thing. So if anyone thinks that MAGA is the answer to the West problems or reform in England, if you think that is the answer, I don't think that you have fully understood the significance of the problem. The left and the right at the moment are not antagonistic. They are complementary. They are part of a single reality promoted by postmodernity, a reality that began long ago in the 16th century. I've spoken about this many times. And the age of rationalism, the so-called Enlightenment, laicism, secularism, and our contemporary society now, our age. So the origin of Putin's traditionalist movement is that his nation found itself in a great void in the 90s. Post-Soviet Russia needed an identity. Who are we? What are we? Where are we going? Russia's original identity had been destroyed. Communists destroyed everything they touch, sterilized the soul of nations. And when Russia was freed from that ideology, Russia was in a void that had to be filled with something. And Russia, after a terrible, devastating 20th century, finally had a break with a leader, Vladimir Putin, who sensed that a restoration of Russia went beyond the economy, went beyond the price of eggs in the supermarket. Russia had to recover its original meaning, its original soul, the traditional moral and spiritual foundation. Some say that President Trump is doing the same in the United States. I don't think it's exactly the same. The moral degradation the country, all of our countries really, that moral degradation in which we find ourselves in goes beyond the price of gas at the pump. And I don't think, I could be mistaken, I don't think Donald Trump is a person who senses that depth. You could say, however, of course, that you have to start somewhere, and perhaps economic recovery is a good start. I agree, yes. You can very well be right there. But the rest of the problems, I think it will have to be, he can start that revolution, but it will have to be another leader after him that addresses those problems. Perhaps, just perhaps, the current Vice President, J.D. Vance, he seems to have enough of a moral grounding to understand that more is needed. Russia had the fortune, much needed, to now have a leader who understood where the problem lay, to find its identity, the nation. So after 7 decades, when the Soviet regime tried to carve out that collective identity around that Marxist historical materialism, which is like trying to make you identify yourself with the metric system or something. The French philosopher René Guénon called it the kingdom of quantity and the sign of the times. That was state atheism, the negation of the spiritual dimension of man, that is to say, the negation of human nature, a system that had fragmented completely the social fabric, that tyranny left a spiritual and a cultural vacuum there. And that vacuum could not be filled with what came next, with that Western liberalism, at first imposed by Boris Yeltsin, for the simple reason that progressive liberalism was simply, it would appear, the other side of the same coin, another form of total and absolute materialism. Remember, the right and the left are not opposites, they are complementary. Western liberalism tried, logically, to build a democratic Russia, an ultra-capitalist Russia, and promoted, of course, as the Soviet world had done, a relativistic moralism that also uprooted Russian society of its cultural and spiritual traditions. And this imposition of foreign values to Russian identity resulted in a profound moral crisis. You see, the idea of the Swedish ombudsman, the defender of the people, works very well, I'm sure, in Sweden and other countries perhaps, but cannot easily be transferred to other cultures and just think that everything is going to be fine, as if there were no differences among nations. And you could, can you transplant legal institutions, social institutions, ways of life, as if you were just changing flower pots from one place to another? That cannot be done. That is ignoring the human condition. That is deliberately ignoring what a people are. And so economic liberalization served only to enrich an oligarchy, corrupt, and to impoverish the whole population to unimaginable extremes of misery. That's what happened to Russia. The Soviet terror hadn't been enough, it seems. Now they were to experience that other foreign, now liberal cultural terror, which ended up disintegrating the poor social cohesion still left and fostering the most absolute cultural nihilism and undermining completely the spiritual roots of the Russian people. So now Putin emerged as a leader. He went ahead and tried to restore the national pride and social cohesion, and chose the reaffirmation of traditional values to do so. I say this with a certain envy of sorts, because Spain went through the same thing, but no one stood up, no leader saw that, for example, in Spain, for Spain to be Spain, it has to be a Catholic Spain or nothing, a bad copy of something else. All our nations, all cultures have an identity, and in your own country and culture, you know very well what that is. And Spain to be Spain has to be Catholic, and Russia to be Russia has to be Orthodox. That's the basis, the cultural basis. So Putin had to rebuild that identity and understood that the crisis could only be resolved not just with economic reforms or political reforms, but from the foundation of a cultural and spiritual renovation of Russia. Russia's identity had to be reconstructed on the basis of its historical roots. It was not enough to deny now one side of history and affirm another. And so his orthodox Christianity and traditional values became the foundation for this renovation and for opposing the moral decadence of the West. And he saw this mission of national reconstruction as a defense of Russia's cultural sovereignty against globalist progressive atheism, and so adopted this traditionalist stance. Vladimir Putin, coming from the old Soviet KGB, the intelligence, he was a lawyer there, a person nevertheless who had lived in the context of his time. And he knew perfectly well how he had to distance himself from one specific period in the life and history of his nation to make a synthesis that would allow him to establish value and pride in the society. He consolidated national unity and projected Russia as the defender, that is how he sees it, of European civilization against the cultural corruption and moral degeneracy of the West. This strengthened Russian national identity and offered a cultural alternative to the division into separate national identities promoted by the West. I'm not saying this because it's not for our countries. It is not a question of copying him. He's operating within the historical context of his own country, but we can nevertheless take what he did with his country as an example to do the same according to each one of us, each one of us cultural tradition, to reproduce that essential revolution in accordance with our own cultural traditions. Of course, we're all saying, yes, we understand the problem and something has to be done. Yes, but something must be done for sure, but at a deeper, more profound sense than just putting a band-aid on the wound. Putin's return to power in 2012 marked a decisive moment in Russian politics because against the massive protests that took place in 2012, promoted by you know who from the West, subversion of individual regions to join them all into join them to this progressive movement. Putin realized that this was a direct attack on Russian sovereignty and stability. It was rather curious that this took place at the same time as other things were going on in the world. The Arab Spring was happening and other color revolutions were starting. And they haven't finished what is happening in Romania right now. But I'm saying that Putin knew how to interpret correctly that direct attack, an attack involving manipulation of the population carried out through the media and the NGOs, etc. A model that was soon afterwards was going to be carbon copied almost, and used in the Ukraine in the 2014 Maidan conflict. Putin observed this attack before it happened in the Ukraine. Putin observed this attack on Russia, clearly an attempt well beyond regime change. And this foreign attack prompted him to adopt this cultural resistance stance against what he calls progressive imperialism or colonialism, because the protests were clearly not just against Putin as a leader, but they were going straight to challenge the cultural and spiritual identity of Russia. And that's why he realized that he had to consolidate a traditionalist narrative based on traditional values, Christian spirituality, and national identity. His speech at the Valdai debate in 2013, I'm going to read you some short excerpts from it. I think you should read it. I find it essential reading, really. It's amazing, actually, because there Putin denounced moral relativism, the moral relativism of the West, defended traditional values as the basis of a national identity, and said the following: in many Euro-Atlantic countries, people are even ashamed or afraid to talk about their religion or religious affiliations. And the excesses of what they call politically correct. At the time, we were still talking about politically correct. And what they call politically correct are leading the West to not only a demographic, but a moral crisis. I'm going to read you some excerpts from it, and I will come back to the point. He says, for us, and I am talking about Russians and Russia, questions about who we are and who we want to be are increasingly prominent in our society. We have left behind Soviet ideology, and there will be no return to that. Proponents of fundamental conservatism who idealize pre-1917 Russia seem to be similarly far from reality, as are the supporters of an extreme Western-style liberalism. It is evident that it is impossible to move forward without spiritual, cultural, and national self-determination. Without this, we will not be able to withstand internal and external challenges, nor will we succeed competing globally. And today we see a new round of such competitions. Today their main focus are economic, technological, and ideological informational. Military political problems and general conditions are worsening. The world is becoming more rigid and sometimes forgoes not merely international law but also basic decency. Another extract. Every country has to have military, technological, and economic strength. But nevertheless, the main thing that will determine success is the quality of citizens, the quality of society, their intellectual, spiritual, and moral strength. After all, in the end, economic growth, prosperity, and geopolitical influence are all derived from societal conditions. They depend on whether the citizens of a given country consider themselves a nation, to what extent their identity with their own history, values, and traditions, and whether they are united by common goals and responsibilities. In this sense, the question of finding and strengthening national identity really is fundamental for Russia. Meanwhile, today's Russia's national identity is experiencing not only objective pressures stemming from globalization, but also the consequences of the national catastrophes of the 20th century, when we experienced the collapse of our state 2 different times, 1917, 1991. The result was a devastating blow to our nation's cultural and spiritual codes. He keeps coming back to equating cultural and moral and spiritual, as you see. We were faced with the disruption of traditions and the consonance of history, with the demoralization of society, with a deficit of trust and responsibility. These are the root causes of many pressing problems we face. After all, the question of responsibility for oneself before society and the law is something fundamental to both legal and everyday life. After 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was the illusion that a new national ideology, a development ideology, would simply appear by itself. The state, authorities, intellectual and political classes virtually rejected engaging in this work, all the more so since previous semi-official ideology was hard to swallow, and in fact they were all simply afraid to even broach the subject. In addition, the lack of a national idea stemming from a national identity profited the quasi-colonial element of the elite, the oligarchs, those determined to steal and remove capital and who did not link their future to that of the country, the place where they earned their money. Another interesting one. Practice has shown that a new national idea does not simply appear, nor does it develop according to market rules. A spontaneously constructed state and society does not work, and neither does mechanically copying other countries' experiences. Such primitive borrowing and attempts to civilize Russia from abroad were not accepted by an absolute majority of our people. This is because the desire for independence and sovereignty in spiritual, ideological, and foreign policy spheres is an integral part of our national character. Incidentally, such approaches have often failed in other nations too. The time when ready-made lifestyle models could be installed in foreign states like computer programs has passed. We also understand that identity and a national idea cannot be imposed from above, cannot be established on an ideological monopoly. Such a construction is very unstable and vulnerable. We know this from personal experience in Russia. It has no future in the modern world. We need historical creativity, a synthesis of the best national practices and ideas, an understanding of our cultural, spiritual, and political traditions from different points of view, and to understand that national identity is not a rigid thing that will last forever, but rather a living organism. Only then will our identity be based on a solid foundation, be directed towards the future and not the past. This is the main argument demonstrating that a development ideology must be discussed by people who hold different views and have different opinions about how and what to do to solve given problems. Another one, Russia's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity are unconditional. These are red lines no one is allowed to cross. For all the differences in our views, Debates about identity and about our national future are impossible unless their participants are patriotic. Of course, I mean patriotism in the purest sense of the word. Too often in our nation's history, instead of opposition to the government, we have been faced with opponents of Russia itself. I have already mentioned this. Pushkin also talked about it, and we know how it ended, with the demolition of the Russian state as such. There is virtually no Russian family that completely escaped the troubles of the past century. Questions about how to assess certain historical events still divide our country and society. We need to heal these wounds and repair the tissues of our historic fabric. We can no longer engage in self-deception, striking out unsightly or ideologically uncomfortable pages of our history, breaking links between generations, rushing to extremes, creating or debunking idols. It's time to stop only taking note of the bad in our history and berating ourselves more than even our opponents would do. Self-criticism is necessary, but without a sense of self-worth or love for our motherland, such criticism becomes humiliating and counterproductive. We must be proud of our history, and we have things to be proud of. Our entire uncensored history must be a part of Russian identity. Without recognizing this, it is impossible to establish mutual trust and allow society to move forward. Another serious challenge to Russia's identity is linked to events taking place in the world. Here there are both foreign policy and moral aspects. We can see how many of the Euro-Atlantic countries are actually rejecting their roots, including the Christian values that constitute the basis of Western civilization. They are denying moral principles and all traditional identities, national, cultural, religious, and even sexual. They are implementing policies, that's us, that equate large families with same-sex partnerships, believe in God with the belief in Satan. The excesses of political correctness have reached the point where people are seriously talking about registering political parties whose aim is to promote, and he uses the word which I cannot use here, I don't think in YouTube, people, adults who love children, kind of thing. Love perhaps is not the right word. People in many European countries are embarrassed or afraid to talk about their religious affiliations. Holy days are abolished. Holy days, not holidays. Holy days are abolished or even called something different. Their essence is hidden away, as is their moral foundation, and people are aggressively trying to export this model all over the world. I am convinced that this opens a direct path to degradation and primitivism, resulting in a profound demographic and moral crisis. What else but the loss of the ability to self-reproduce could act as the greatest testimony of the moral crisis facing a human society? Today, almost all developed nations are no longer able to reproduce themselves, even with the help of migration. Without the values embedded in Christianity and other world religions, without the standards of morality that have taken shape over millennia, people will inevitably lose their human dignity. we consider it natural and right to defend these values. One must respect every minority's right to be different, but the rights of the majority must not be put into question. At the same time, we see attempts to somehow revive a standardized model of a unipolar world and to blur the institutions of international law and national sovereignty. Such a unipolar, standardized world does not require sovereign states. It requires vassals. In a historical sense, this amounts to a rejection of one's own identity and the God-given diversity of the world. Then he goes on for a while about the importance of education and teachers and the educational system. Quite a while. I want to stress again that without focusing our efforts on people's education and health, creating mutual responsibility between the authorities and each individual, and establishing trust within society, we will be losers in the competition of history. Russia's citizens must feel that they are responsible owners of their country, region, hometown, property, belongings, and their lives. A citizen is someone who is capable of independently managing his or her own affairs, freely cooperating with equals. These are some of the excerpts of that talk. This is an act of no more or no less than an act of what he's talking about: cultural sovereignty, spiritual and moral sovereignty, of national identity, of resistance, that resistance that, as Dominic Bernes said, actually to exist is to combat that which denies me. To exist is to combat that which denies me. In other words, if you don't fight that which denies you, you're not alive, you're dead. So one should not, I don't think, yield or compromise or dialogue or tolerate the one that's trying to destroy you. With an enemy that's out to destroy you, perhaps you do not dialogue politely. With an enemy, one is not to contemporize. With an enemy, you do not perhaps negotiate. With an adversary, yes. People with different opinions and different, yes. But one that's out to destroy you, you neutralize him. You combat him, you fight him, and you either live or you die, but you die standing up and not on your knees asking to be loved and accepted, and you defend your homeland and your culture. There are three authors. Everybody says that Alexander Dugin is the main philosopher, that the philosopher that has influenced him most. I don't know, perhaps there are three philosophers that have certainly influenced him on this cultural and moral resistance. Three authors who have always defended the need to preserve this cultural identity against Western influences. Of course, everyone knows about Dostoevsky, but there are others, and who project a vision of the world based on tradition and spirituality and patriotism. There is a very old Russian song Perhaps I will put the link here. I actually found it. About how is it that when did we realize that we loved our country? How did it begin? Our love for our country, for our homeland. And this is sung by a Russian Jew, actually, Mark Bernes. And the lyrics are, what was the beginning of that love when you identified yourself with your country? Was it perhaps, it's actually very beautiful. I'm sure it's more beautiful in Russian, you know, with the poetry and the rhyming of words. But he says, perhaps with a picture in your ABC book as a child, perhaps when you're playing with your mates out in the neighborhood. Maybe it began with the songs that your mother sang to you, sitting on her lap, or when you went to sleep. It begins with those things, the song says. It begins with those things that no one can take away from you. How does the love of country, when did it begin? Perhaps it was at that bench by the gate where you hang around with your friends. Maybe that gorgeous tree in front of the house you climbed or hid as a boy. Or maybe with the first song of the starling, we go into poetry here, or that endless cobble street, or was it all those windows shining in the distance when all else was dark? Or perhaps one day you found your granddad's old military cap or a war medal. You found it there in the back of a closet. No one had seen it for years. Perhaps it's the picture of the memories of that old train, the choo-choo of the whistle, sounding, the sound of the whistle, the old trains. An oath you took as a youth in your heart. That's a song, but there are these three philosophers that I was telling you about. One of them is Ivan Illing, a philosopher and theologian who defended, actually, he left it, but he was the founder of the Fascist Party of Russia back in the day, in the 1920s or so. Left it, but mainly a philosopher and theologian who defended the need for a strong state and a spiritual identity based on, in the case of Russia, obviously Orthodox Christianity. He wrote on patriotism and on the defense of the traditions of the nation. I think Putin has probably adopted some of his ideas. He died in Switzerland in exile, and Putin brought his remains back to Russia. He died in 1948, I think. Another one was Nikolai Berdayev, who was born in 1874 in Kiev, Ukraine, in the Russian Empire, died in 1948 in France, and he was a religious thinker, philosopher, a Marxist who became a critic of Russian implementation of Karl Marx's views, and later a leading representative of Christian existentialism, school of philosophy that stresses examination of the human condition within a Christian framework. So a Christian existentialist who said that Russia had a unique spiritual mission in the world based on her faith and her capacity to resist the moral decadence of the West. He could already see that in the 40s. And another one was Let Gumilyov, who was an ecologist and historian who developed the theory of passion and explains the survival of civilizations by means of the preservation of their cultural identity in the face of globalist influences. And these three main points of support, these are the ones with which Putin rebuilds Russian cultural identity and offers a cultural and moral alternative to Western nihilism. He criticizes the loss of national identity in the European Union and its impact on the economy. Why? Because all this gang of leaders representing the kingdom of quantity, they're all at the service of money. Just that. They are the ones who talk about diversity when the only thing they pretend to do is turn black and white and any other color, so to speak, into gray. Russian traditionalism has evolved from the need to reaffirm their identity and a core of resistance against the West's cultural hegemony. Policies that protect the national identity. I saw a newspaper headline with a picture of Putin, and the headline said, Putin against Western values, persecution of LGBT. This is false. No one is being persecuted in Russia for being heterosexual or homosexual. What you cannot do is to go around insisting that you are a dog because you're not, or a cat because you're not, and demanding that everyone treats you as such, because that's insane. If two women are lost in a desert island for 20 years, however much their biology will allow them to get pregnant, they're never going to become pregnant, because an essential part of becoming pregnant is missing, and that is the male. And so after 20 or 40 years they'll die with no reproduction. In 2020, Putin promoted a constitutional reform that defined marriage as the union between a man and a woman. That reform not only preserves the Russian cultural identity, but consolidates it as an act of cultural sovereignty. So he is defending the traditional family and also Russian cultural identity against moral corruption promoted by that gross relativism. Obviously, this means that the defense of the traditional family is in the Constitution as a key in the identity and culture of the country, in this way protecting the hard cultural core of a country. And they have a family flag. It is blue, and it shows a man and a woman, and each one holding the hands of a child. So when dealing with these problems that we have in the West, we must consider going beyond ascending to a vision that's above the purely economic and political and geopolitical and strategic, and enter into the cultural and moral and spiritual depths in order to try to resolve this conflict. I just wanted to talk about Putin today. After Ukraine, therefore, the fight will still go on. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.